Welcome to A Conversation with History. I'm Harry Kreisler of the Institute of International Studies. Our guest today is Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, who from 2002 to 2005 was Chief of Staff to Secretary of State Colin Powell. He has a military career going back 30 years, during which time he was Associate Director of Policy Planning at State Department and Director of the Marine War College. Colonel Wilkerson, welcome to Berkeley.
Thank you.
Where were you born and raised?
Gaffney, South Carolina. You can't tell by my accent?
I'm hearing it right now. Looking back, how do you think your parents shaped your thinking about the world?
My father, as most in his generation did, participated in World War II and stayed for a while afterwards. And so I became fascinated with the military life early.
Mm-hmm. And when did you decide to go into the military? Did you do your college work first, or?
I was a senior at Bucknell University in central Pennsylvania, and some of my fraternity brothers who were ahead of me had gone to Vietnam as Marines or soldiers. One of my dear friends had been killed there, and so I did a really wild thing in my senior year. I walked out and enlisted.
Mm-hmm. And throughout your career, in addition to being a soldier, you've actually been very interested in military curriculum and the teaching of soldiers as the missions of the military has changed over time?
Yes. The seminal educational experience for me in the military was at the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island in the early 80s. It's fair to say that that changed my whole perspective and really changed my life. The pedagogical technique there had been introduced by Stansfield Turner. Mm-hmm. Some of the best instruction I've ever received was accomplished there. Civilian military tag team in seminars. Mm-hmm. My civilian was a PhD from Princeton. My military guy had two PhDs, mm-hmm. one in comparative literature and one in religions. He was a Mormon, mm-hmm. baccalaureate at Brigham Young University. And those two people just stimulated that seminar for 9 months in ways that I had never seen or experienced before.
And was it putting the military's mission in the context of strategic
Exactly.
and organizational
Exactly.
issues and so on?
It was matching policy and strategy and keeping civil-military relations on the up and up while you did it.
Mm-hmm. And so looking back now and all that you know, what do you think are the skills required to be a soldier today, and how does that kind of differ from when you went into the military?
It's a very different situation today. At the basic level, it's extremely different because my platoon, for example, in basic training, 42 men, was 2 volunteers, myself included, and 40 draftees. Mm-hmm. So we had America in that platoon. Mm-hmm. We had lawyers' sons and doctors' sons, and we had, the socioeconomic condition that predominates in the military today. And that's the significant difference. The volunteer force today is a very different force from that force that I came into. And in some ways, I think we're courting danger as a republic with this kind of military. It's turning. I'm the last person to criticize the military, but I have to be honest about this. The military is turning more into a French Foreign Legion type force than what I grew up in and what I was a member of.
And is this probably is the result of politicians worried about the implications of the draft for the strategies that they might pursue on the one hand?
I think it has that dimension. It's much easier to use a volunteer force.
Yeah.
You don't have the, for example, you don't have the criticism that occurred in the latter years of the Vietnam conflict, for example, because of the lottery. It's a very technically oriented force, and so it's better to have people who stay a while. You don't want those 2-year people who come and go, which the draft gives you. And it's also a force that's better educated in the sense that the recruiting standards have been kept fairly high. Because
You mean now?
no, before, when they first implemented the volunteer force.
I see, right.
Getting to now, those standards are going down for the land forces in particular. In my Army, they're just plummeting. Non-high school diplomas, non-high school graduates, Category 4s, mental Category 4, which means they can't hardly read their name on a guard roster. 42-year-olds in the combat arms and so forth. The standards have been lowered significantly in order to keep up with the pace of operations.
Your background, as you've just touched on, led you to have this extraordinary opportunity to, as a military man, to staff national security officials, and this is how you established a relationship with Colin Powell. Talk a little about that and your duty with him, how it began, and so on.
I was teaching at the Naval War College, very, very content to be doing so, and I received a call one day to come down and meet the National Security Advisor from Ronald Reagan, which was his duty at the time. I did so. He had just left the White House. It was 25 January 1989, and I interviewed with him, and long story short, a few months later, I thought I'd failed the interview. He asked me, did I want the job? I said, no. I'm very happy doing what I'm doing. I love teaching. Thought that was the end of it. Well, he later revealed to me that that's the reason he picked me.
I see.
I didn't want the job. So I went to work for him. I went to work for him as a speechwriter and special assistant, and wrote most of his speeches in the early days, and then became, I like to think, I think he would testify to this, a personal confidant and an advisor on strategic issues. Barry McCaffrey, whom you may know, once said to me in the chairman's mess, you know, you're a better strategist than you are a speechwriter. I said, I'll take that as a compliment, General.
Of course, some speechwriters for other officials haven't known strategy, and that may be where the problem. Colin Powell is a very important figure in the history of the latter period of the Cold War and even to the present. Characterize him for him, because you probably have seen the elements of what make him such an extraordinary figure.
I characterize him as a black Eisenhower. I think some people have called him, because he will often say that George Marshall is his hero, his role model. But I think Eisenhower fits that characterization better than Marshall does. Eisenhower had, as we all know now, not a predilection for politics, but he certainly went into it, and he had some success at it. Marshall didn't even vote, as he said to Truman. And I also think that Powell has the same kind of instincts that I like to think Eisenhower had from all the reading I've done about him. And of course, he was president while I was a young person. And I think, other than what we might say about Powell as an individual, that's the best way I could succinctly describe him to the world, as a black Eisenhower, but one who decided at the end, for a number of reasons that Eisenhower wouldn't have had, not to go into electoral politics, not to run for presidency, and perhaps have saved us from some of the turmoil we've had over the last few years.
And I get the sense from what you said here and other places that he had a sense of the complexity and subtleness of the politics when you were dealing with major strategic issues, relations with allies, thinking about bringing the world along on particular problems.
Yes, as a matter of fact, he was so acutely aware of that ability that one of the things he said to me in his interview with me in the Pentagon in 1989 was, you know, I was there when Gorbachev made his seminal statements. I was there when we met in St. Catharines. I was there when this happened. I was National Security Advisor. And I'm not going to relinquish all of that as I become a four-star general, because these are perilous times. These are tumultuous times. And I am going to speak out a little more probably than the average Army general because I've had these experiences and so forth. And so I knew when I signed on with him that this was not going to be your standard flag officer with whom I was destined to work for 16 years.
You're a person who studied national security and done national security, and I want you to give us a sense of what it was like when the 9/11 attack occurred, because it seems that shock sort of changed things, both in terms of the response that was chosen, but also in terms of the fact that we had been hit on the homeland.
Right. Well, the immediate, what I would say as a military man, the tactical happenings were that I got out of a taxi, heard it on the radio. I was right in front of the State Department, and when I heard it on the radio, I realized it was probably a terrorist attack. I ran into the State Department only to meet everyone coming out because we had just been told that the attacks had occurred. We were worried we were on the target list. Indeed, someone had reported that a car bomb had gone off on C Street right outside. So, and we could see the black plume of smoke coming up from the Pentagon across the river. And so that was the immediate circumstance. Even with that, though, on that very same day and night and the next day, a team assembled around Secretary Powell, and we essentially built the strategy for what would become known as the global war on terror. And that was more or less built around a huge matrix with all the countries that we thought would have capabilities, hundreds. Down the left-hand side was the capability, whether it was provide troops and what type of troops, provide logistics and what type of logistics, overflight rights, basing rights, political support, and so forth. And out of that matrix came our diplomatic strategy for what we would tell our country teams, our ambassadors, our consular officers, and so forth, to pursue with that government. And, of course, with the principal governments like Jack Straw in England and so forth, Powell would be a part of that pursuit. And we built that strategy, and that strategy was focused on, as you might suspect, Afghanistan and one or two other places where we knew through intelligence that al-Qaeda-like groups were. Iraq was nowhere on that matrix.
And when you finally were really the first, I think, person to come out once you had left the State Department and describe what you saw, what actually happened in terms of American strategy. I want to go into that analysis now because you have said rather clearly that there was a breakdown in the policy process. And I assume from your analysis that what you just described wasn't integrated into what became the American strategy after the success in Afghanistan.
Actually, it was even before the success in Afghanistan, such as it was culminated. And I can't tell you exactly where it happened, but I can tell you, I think, the mechanism through which it happened. The mechanism was a cabal, as I've called it in the past, between the Vice President and the Secretary of Defense in order to subvert the statutory decision-making process and to essentially achieve the objectives that those two wanted to achieve, and principally, I mean, the Vice President wanted to achieve. Was there presidential complicity in this, as there was, for example, when Kissinger and Nixon stepped outside the statutory process and conducted their rapprochement with China, or when Brzezinski and Carter stepped outside the process and totally isolated their State Department? This has happened before, in other words. I don't know. I tend to think that this was a step outside the statutory decision-making process by a vice president who was unprecedentedly powerful, the most powerful vice president we've ever had, and a Secretary of Defense who was in league with him. Indeed, they both had been Secretaries of Defense. And their body language, when you saw them together, you didn't know which one was Vice President and which one was Secretary of Defense. I think this was unique in the sense that they did it but they did it under the vice president's tutelage, as it were, and not with the president not being a very, not being an individual steeped in national security affairs, not being an individual who cared very much about foreign policy, indeed who tossed it off, who was aloof from the details of it. They were able to exploit that in ways that probably even Kissinger didn't exploit when he was the most powerful, indeed, when he was National Security Advisor and Secretary of State simultaneously.
Yeah. Now, it becomes very important to understand how somebody like you, who has broad experience in national security, what was going on here once we accept your description? In other words, how do we understand Rumsfeld and Cheney? Is it their experience in the Ford administration was a formative experience, that is the kind of loss of presidential authority in the transition from Nixon to Ford and the effort to restore it? Or was it their long-term career in national security where they were always outriders? How do you explain, because what they really were was extremists, as you're describing them.
Radicals.
Radicals, but not in a Berkeley sense.
Right.
We got to watch how we use that word.
The radical right.
Yeah. Well, but how do you account for that? Because I don't think when you talk about principles, it would be very hard to find in all the cast of characters in the latter part of the Cold War people acting as they did. So how do we why were they that way?
No, I couldn't agree with you more, and I would also go back a little and tell you, as you probably are well aware, that they had a lot to do with the end of Henry Kissinger,
Right.
Cheney and Rumsfeld
Yes,
together,
yeah,
because they thought détente, being soft on the Soviet Union and so forth, was not their policy. I think they brought some of that into this administration, but they also brought, and if you look at Cheney's dissenting opinion on the Tower Commission report, for example, and you understand what he believes in his heart of hearts about executive power, you begin to get some insight into this. They came in with clearly an ultra-nationalist, unilateralist even agenda, which one could say is really right on the realist spectrum, and accept as something that you've seen before and you can deal with. 9/11 then gave them a new prerogative, a new flexibility. It gave them the right to use the politics of fear, as McCarthy had done, for example, earlier in the Cold War, not just to maintain their own power and to keep themselves in power, as Karl Rove was so eloquent at expressing at various meetings, but also to begin to fulfill their agenda, which had become even more radical because now they were motivated by almost a paranoia about having something happen on their watch again that was 10 times worse than 9/11, a nuclear weapon or a dirty radiological bomb or something like that. And so they were motivated by not only their agenda and their feelings about executive power and the fact that the U.S. Constitution is really an anachronism in this modern world where dangers lurk behind every corner. They also had the fact that 9/11 had given them a new imprimatur for doing that. And all of this came together. The neocons, which I don't believe Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney were for a minute, flowed into this too. An unholy alliance occurred, and all of a sudden you had strategic failure of huge proportions, in my view, because of this alliance.
And you just made a very important point, and I want to explain that to the audience so that the neocons are associated with ideals such as transforming societies in the Middle East to democracy. Also a heavy emphasis on support of Israel. But what you are saying that Rumsfeld and Cheney were extremists on the realism scale, but also American nationalists.
Right.
And as American nationalists saw American military power as giving us the ability to do things to shape the world and shape particular regions, but not necessarily toward achieving democratization.
No, I think that was a neocon agenda, and it just
Yeah.
melded well with their motivations and with what they wanted to do. And it gave them a little more power within the bureaucracy because neocons had been placed carefully within the bureaucracy. At the same time, I think it's necessary to point out that Rumsfeld and Cheney's idea of a strategic approach to the world had shifted traditional American thinking at least since the Monroe Doctrine. And by that I mean, prior to that, we had more or less said we'll maintain hegemony in the Western Hemisphere and we'll join concerts of power elsewhere in order to meet a threat in the heartland of Europe or in Asia or indeed in the Middle East. All of a sudden, we had Rumsfeld and Cheney saying, we are so dominant now in this post-Cold War world that we are the world's hegemon. We're the new Rome.
And this goes back to the Pentagon guidance document that was written in Cheney's shop when he was Secretary of Defense.
And became Section 5 of the new National Security Strategy.
Right.
Yeah.
But at that time, the first President Bush, because of the clamor, they pulled that back.
In fact, he even said something like, this is from the nuts in the basement.
I see. So in his son's administration, the nuts in the basement.
The nuts got in the Oval Office.
Yeah. It's sort of like, remember arsenic and old lace with when Uncle Teddy in the attic?
Right.
Yes. Okay. Now, you are a man, you're an operational officer. You're a man who gets things done. And what you're suggesting in your analysis when you've gone public on these issues is that they subverted the implementation process because they were so committed to secrecy that they wanted to say we're doing certain things, to not have a debate among the deputies and the principals who would help principals think through the process of what was being proposed. Talk a little about that, because that may be the most insidious element of what you're describing, because you've been very good at articulating the notion that this went against the laws, the rules, the way of operating that go back all the way to the end of the Second World War.
All right. This was an interesting thing to watch from the perspective of bureaucracy. At the lower level, where the first tier of this decision-making, for example, that's been more or less formalized since George H.W. Bush, the interagency working groups, the Deputies Committee, the Principals Committee, and then the National Security Council itself. At the interagency working group level, normally chaired by an Assistant Secretary of State or Defense, whoever had the biggest dog in the fight, Vice President Cheney would have his staff sitting. And if a discussion at that low level even were going on that looked like to that individual that it was moving in a direction the Vice President would not approve of, that individual would throw the monkey wrench on the table. Everyone in the room knew, even the Assistant Secretary chairing the meeting, that he spoke for the Vice President. And increasingly as time went by, they knew that in spades. That issue would be stymied right there in the interagency working group. It wouldn't go any further. If it did happen to eke out because an assistant secretary really had a big, set of whatever, cojones, then it would work out and get to the Deputies Committee, where it again would meet a similar attack from whomever the Vice President, maybe even the Vice President himself if he wanted to drop by, and it would usually die there. If it did happen to make it up all the way to the principals or to the National Security Council, a formal meeting, Iran, for example, then it got handled in an entirely different way. And this was incredibly astute, the way these people did this. There was never a national security decision document issued on Iran. I think if I'm right, there's not even one now. And what happened was the debate in the process was so rancorous and involved so many of the 800-pound gorillas, the actual cabinet officers or their deputies, and was so vitriolic that the statutory process was stymied and couldn't come to a decision, and therefore, by default, Cheney got what he wanted, which was no talks, no diplomacy, no policy formalized vis-a-vis Iran. So that was one technique he used. Another technique he used was to allow the process to work when it was an issue like North Korea and the six-party talks, which the president was interested in and the president had blessed. What happened there was you would get a decision within that framework in the National Security Council or in the principals meeting. Off would go Assistant Secretary of State James Kelly to implement that decision vis-a-vis the six parties, principally North Korea. Midstream in the Pacific, an order would come from the Vice President to straitjacket that individual. In other words, we know what the President said. I'm telling you, you don't have that leeway. You don't have that flexibility. You're in a straitjacket now. Talks are going to fail. The North Koreans are going to walk out or they're not going to produce anything. Was the President approached by the Vice President before that signal was sent? Probably, because as often happened, after the formal meeting, the Vice President would get the last bite at the apple in the Oval Office and be persuasive with the President, and then the President would reverse himself or change his decision or amend it in some way. One of the most dramatic decisions in terms of its effects in this regard was the decision to disband the Iraqi army by L. Paul Bremer in Iraq. The President had made in a formal meeting a decision not to disband the Iraqi army down from the battalion and below level. The President had made that decision. Well, a week or so later, Ambassador Bremer reverses that decision and disbands the Iraqi army. Surprise to the Secretary of State, surprise, I'm told, even to the Secretary of Defense. How did that happen? Did someone go back in and talk to the President and get him to reverse his decision? He never said anything about it, so they must have. If it was someone, that someone was probably the Vice President.
And you identify in some of the speeches that I've read and the interviews that you've had, essentially two areas. And you started talking about one, namely the post-conflict plans for Iraq, and this disbanding of the military was one of those things. The other being the whole decisions about torture and not sticking by the Geneva Conventions on the treatment of prisoners of war. So in both of these cases, this process was working. Now, implicitly, you're identifying a failure of leadership by the National Security Advisor.
Absolutely,
yeah.
and by the President.
Yeah, but in other words, that role, as it's come to be defined with people like Brzezinski and Kissinger, was to knock heads together and point out to the President.
To discipline the process.
Yeah, to discipline the process. And in both cases, it failed. But and I get the sense that this was all about a determined Vice President with experience with the bureaucracy who basically wanted to close down alternatives to what was being proposed. In other words, it reversed our notion that debate, discussion, analysis by different parties in the process helps clarify what we want to do.
I think that's absolutely right. That's a characterization I would support. The Vice President was right for whatever reasons, and didn't want to brook any dissent, and knew the bureaucracy would be forced eventually to do what he wanted to do. And so, damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead. I think that was their philosophy. It took us quite a while at State, us being Rich, Colin, myself, Rich Armitage, the Deputy Secretary of State, to realize that we were operating on a crisis du jour basis with a vision that went all the way back to World War II. A multilateralism, talk to allies, consult with allies, move against something slowly and with prudence, and always with your allies.
That was your way of thinking.
That was our way of thinking.
Yeah.
It wasn't revolutionary. It was very consistent with half a century of American foreign policy. We were up against a group that was possessed of a vision, had articulated to themselves a strategy to bring that vision into being, and were ruthless, utterly ruthless in doing it. And it took us a while to figure that out, and by the time we'd figured it out, we had the Deputy Secretary of State, for example, characterizing them as the Nazis the Gestapo.
Yeah, and that's actually a very interesting point, because I have a sense that the establishment in Washington, and here I'm not just talking about, you know, people at state, but here the press, the Washington establishment press, the Congress, was slow because it was difficult to come to an understanding of how extremist these were. Is that a fair assessment? And I talk a little about that process, because in the beginning it's not so clear what's going on, I guess, right?
It's not. I think in the beginning, before 9/11, for example, there was a pool as to which cabinet officer would go first, and everyone was betting on Rumsfeld because he had so messed up the Pentagon in terms of, and Wolfowitz had helped him. They just weren't running it very well, and the confrontations with the uniformed military were significant. Rumsfeld's power plays were not working very well. His battle with the Army was becoming a casus belli for the rest of the armed forces. So we were all saying he was going to be gone. And then comes 9/11, and he becomes Secretary of War, not Secretary of Defense. Rolls up his sleeves, goes outside the Pentagon in the smoke and the debris, and makes himself a hero overnight, and even becomes, in one commentator's words, a sex symbol as he does his press conferences and so forth. Turned everything around. 9/11, I think, turned the rest of the government around with respect to obeisance to the commander-in-chief, including the Congress. And it didn't hurt that it was in the hands of the Republicans at that time, and the leadership, I think, was as feckless as leadership as we ever had, except possibly for the Democratic leadership in the Congress right now. Reid and Pelosi are unimpressive, totally unimpressive. But the Congress became an obedient lapdog of the White House rather than a separate and equal branch of government. And oversight was virtually non-existent. And that didn't help us at all either, as we began to realize what was going on, and we began to realize that even our oversight committees in some respects were complicit with what was going on. You couldn't talk to Dick Lugar, for example, of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee about your deep concerns because he was a Republican. You went and talked to Joe Biden about them. That's not the way business should be conducted.
Now, let's talk briefly about the second issue, which is this whole violation of Geneva Conventions, the whole abuse of intelligence to get information, which then leads to torture and so on. And there, I think it's important to emphasize that for example, the JAGs saw the problem here and tried to resist, but were unsuccessful.
That's true. Alberto Moro, having been very eloquent in talking about that, the Navy JAG. I think what happened here was you had 6 lawyers, and I'll name them for you. Douglas Feith, who was the number 3 man at the Pentagon, Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, OSD General Counsel, Rumsfeld's lawyer, if you will, Haynes. That's at the Pentagon. Then you had 2 at the Office of Legal Counsel and Department of Justice, who I think were working without even the Attorney General's knowledge, John Yoo and Jay Bybee. And then you had the head of all this in the Vice President's office, David Addington, who is the counselor for the Vice President. When David was in the Pentagon, we had an expression for him. We called him Weird David because of his views on the U.S. Constitution and so forth. And then you had Alberto Gonzales, who was the President's counselor at the time. These 6 lawyers designed a legal foundation for detainee abuse, if you will, even torture, well before anyone in the field actually requested clarification of same so that they could do what they needed to do at Guantanamo or Bagram in Afghanistan or Abu Ghraib in Iraq. This was all carefully done so that when the gloves came off, the legal foundation would be there and people would not have to fear going to jail afterwards. So I don't see this as something that started at the bottom. This is something that started right at the top with David Addington and Dick Cheney and filtered down to the bottom.
Now, so this then, you use the word cabal. One could use the word conspiracy. You could use the word obsession with a vision about how the world should work. And again, we should remind our audience that the leadership here had experience with the fall of the Nixon presidency. They had experience with the Iran-Contra and then the Tower Commission, which you referred to, where Cheney in his Minority Report proposed the unitary president. And you had two men, actually, Rumsfeld and Cheney, who had aspired to be president and never made the cut, basically. So you are, it's almost as if you're describing a Berkeley radical's imagination of a reality that we all believe didn't exist, and you're telling me that it did exist.
There's some truth to that. I even think if I were a psychoanalyst and I wanted to approach it from this angle, that when George W. Bush turned to Richard Bruce Cheney and said, head my vice presidential committee, it was moments after that he decided he was going to be vice president. And by vice president, surrogate president.
Now, there was a point at which an alternative was being considered to be Secretary of Defense. I think it was Senator Coates.
Right.
Was that just a play?
Who failed the interview with George W. Bush.
Right.
But one doesn't know why he failed.
Right. So then that would play into your notion that there was a... All right. So
I think looking back on the history of it, I think they had to do that, they being Cheney principally, Addington no doubt. They had to do that, they had to orchestrate it that way because 41, George H.W. Bush, didn't care very much for Donald Rumsfeld. And so they had to give the appearance, at least, that they had looked at someone else before they could turn to Rumsfeld. Now, Rumsfeld was targeted for the CIA, and I'm told by sources I valued the opinion of, Rumsfeld said not only no, but hell no. And so this all worked itself out to Cheney's benefit.
Now, we come to an important point here, which is if once you discover, and I don't mean just you, but once there is a kind of realization of what's going on here, when does one go public? We've had Robert McNamara on this program, and I've discussed this with him about the Vietnam War. So the question becomes, what is the dilemma here? You ultimately did go public. I think you were the first person who really called a spade and went out and did it. Your principal, Colin Powell, never did. Talk about that dilemma.
It is a dilemma, and it's real. I tell my students this all the time. You have mortgages, you have children in college and so forth. It's not that easy to say, I quit. You should probably never take one of these positions unless you're perfectly prepared to be fired, and that means you can quit. That said, it came upon me personally right after the 5 February presentation at the UN Security Council, 2003. I thought that I had done such a bad job there in putting that presentation together as I watched it on the floor of the UN Security Council, which incidentally was the first time I'd seen it start to finish. Every time before there'd been some kind of interruption or what. And I walked out in that bracing New York air in February, and I said, I'm resigning. I'm leaving. I'd already thought about it a lot during the process of building up to the presentation.
This, by the way, should explain to our audience, is Colin Powell's presentation to the UN about
Iraq's weapons of mass destruction.
Right.
Yeah. I'd already thought about it during the time. In fact, I'd already typed it up during the time I was doing it because I thought it was an impossible task. 5 days and nights to present this monumental case. And then as time went by and as I went through the Abu Ghraib photos where the secretary came through the door to our office, our adjoining door, and he said to me, Larry, put this together. I've got Will Taft, my lawyer, working on it from a legal perspective. I want you to work on it from a political and fundamental perspective of how did this happen? How did we get to the point where these prisoners are being abused like this and so forth? And I put together a dossier for the secretary. And all the time I'm also watching Iraq closely, and I'm seeing things deteriorate. I'm seeing things falling apart. I'm seeing the State Department isolated, not able to participate in what's happening in Iraq. I'm beginning to understand what the Rumsfeld-Cheney cabal meant to happen in Iraq that didn't happen, installing Ahmad Chalabi and leaving is what I'm talking about. I'm seeing all of this. So by the time I got to the end of 2004, and walked out of the State Department the next month, I had a real battle going on inside myself. And I decided that I would start going around to the war colleges and speaking on a non-attribution basis. And I did so. And what stunned me at these war colleges was when it came time for the question and answer period. 400 soldiers, sailors, airmen out there, all lieutenant colonels, majors, colonels, captains in the Navy. I thought I would get a barrage of question and answers that would just devastate me. I'd have a difficult time answering them and holding my, my pitch. Instead, I got people telling me, "You don't know the half of it. You don't know how bad it is. Let me tell you my story." And we would go into seminars, smaller seminars after the general lecture, and I would hear from the National Guard, the Reserve, the active component, all these horror stories about what was happening.
That is in terms of preparation for the war?
In terms of what was happening in Iraq.
Oh, I see. Once we were there, yeah.
Preparation, looting, the fact no one had a strategy, no one had a plan, no one had a clue how to deal with this situation. Leaders were disrespected. I mean, it was incredible. And so that all came in on me, and I said, my responsibility to not speak out as a serving active duty military officer or now retired one is such that I can't adhere to it anymore. The protocols are gone. I'm going to speak out publicly, and that's how I decided to.
Now, I guess in the mind of someone like Colin Powell is the notion that you stay in because you might hold back the system from going off the deep end. Is that a fair assessment? Namely, that you hope that by staying in you can maneuver the system so that the damage won't be as great as it might have been?
You would not have wanted, nor would any other American of reasonably sound mind, have wanted to see those first 4 years without Colin Powell.
Yeah.
From China, which he took at the very beginning when the EP-3 and the F-8 collided and our EP-3 reconnaissance plane went down on Hainan Island, he took over the U.S.-China account. I'll have to admit, the President was on his side. The President, for economic reasons, his economic instincts told him the U.S.-China relationship, Walmart and everything else, was very important. So he backed Powell 9 times out of 10 on China. But Powell took over the account from people in the Vice President's office and the Secretary of Defense's office who wanted China to be the new Soviet Union. Wanted to keep the military and industrial complex vibrant and robust, and wanted to take on, as many did in the early 50s, the Soviet Union, China before it became so powerful. You had people in the press and people in the Congress who were advocating this position too. So Powell took that account and ran with it. Powell held hands under the table. Joschka Fischer from Germany, Dominique de Villepin from France, Ana Palacio from Spain, to keep the transatlantic relationship from sundering. Here we had a president in the Oval Office calling the German chancellor an asshole. I mean, Powell did so much damage. You used the right term, damage control. That's what Powell did for 4 years, was damage control. And you wouldn't have wanted to see that administration without Powell in there to keep the damage from being so deep that it was maybe irreparable.
How much damage has all of this that is going into Iraq, being ill-prepared for no preparation for the post-conflict stabilization process, staying there, creating a situation where we can't get out. How much damage has been done to the military as an instrument of our foreign policy?
Incredible damage, particularly to the land forces, Marines and Army, and particularly to the transport fleet of our Air Force, whose aircraft are flying their wings off. Navy a little bit less so, but the Navy now is running into operational tempo, not unlike some of the land forces, as we're keeping this presence in the Indian Ocean and so forth vis-a-vis Iran. I can't tell you the degree of the damage other than to tell you that the bill for bringing the Army and the Marine Corps back to readiness standards pre-March 19th, 2003 is probably $150 to $160 billion. This is Apaches, M1 tanks, Black Hawk helicopters. This is 5 and 10 ton trucks. This is the whole panoply of the Army's readiness posture that's been eaten up at a vastly accelerated rate by this war in Iraq. And this is a very small Army and a very small Marine Corps too. So the damage that's been done to our military forces is significant. You're finally hearing the Chief of Staff of the Army and others, Admiral Mullen, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, talking about this now, how this can't continue. This is unsustainable. And at the same time, you've got Afghanistan, which is truly a real strategic problem and will be the demise of NATO if it's not handled successfully. That's not getting the attention it should be getting because Iraq is taking all the troops.
With all of this wreckage, and you've just articulated how this process worked and so on, what was in the mind of this Cheney-Rumsfeld cabal? What is it about absolute power unchecked? Because if we look at the international environment, there was no balancer. We had lost the Soviet Union, whose ability to balance our power was constrained what we can do in the world. Right. In the end, what was this about? Power, oil, or what?
I think for Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney, to varying degrees and with different nuances, power is what it's all about. Mm-hmm. I think, for example, Donald Rumsfeld's slide rule was not morality as you and I understand it. It was, if it goes and increases my power, it's good. If it decreases my power, it's bad. Cheney, I think, has a little more altruism to him, if you will, than that. He's not a completely amoral person. But I think a story told to me by a congressman from Oklahoma is probably more apt than I thought it was when he told me. He said, I've known Dick Cheney ever since he came out of Wyoming. Dick Cheney is not, as Brent Scowcroft has recently said, and he'd said it in the New Yorker magazine in an interview, a man I don't recognize. I recognize Dick Cheney. The difference between Dick Cheney then and Dick Cheney now, being his vice president, is that before he always had adult supervision. He either had George Herbert Walker Bush on top and Colin Powell on the bottom, or he had a whole Congress arrayed around him, or he had Gerald Ford over him when he was Chief of Staff at the age of 34, or he had Donald Rumsfeld over him. He now, for the first time in his life, has no adult supervision, and he's a wild man. This is what the congressman said to me. I think there's some truth to that. There is no adult supervision, and that is a direct reflection on the man I voted for and we elected, however imperfectly, as President of the United States.
So, two questions come to my mind now. What does the next president, whoever he is or she is, do about this wreckage? I'm not asking you to give me a solution about Iraq so much as I'm interested in restoring the integrity of the national security process.
Right. That's a huge question for whomever it is. And I think that question is going to be complicated in major ways by the fact that I think, in my view, we are confronting a financial and economic crisis right now that may take on dimensions that even surpass the crisis that Franklin Roosevelt had to deal with. And that focuses the mind incredibly and makes you tend to be insular, domestically oriented, and forget foreign policy. That, I think, is going to be a huge challenge for whomever it is. That said, what they're going to have to do, I think, is from the bully pulpit, which after all is the real tool of the president of this country, they're going to have to articulate an entirely new vision, and then more or less their actions are going to have to match that vision. And that's everything from closing Guantanamo and renouncing torture and defining waterboarding as torture, for example, to, on the other side of the coin, beginning to talk to our enemies, beginning to deal with our enemies, like Iran, for example, negotiate, use the diplomatic tool, use the economic tool, use the cultural and informational tool, and back away from the military tool. The image we present in the world today is the image of the Star Wars battleship, the trooper with the star, yeah,
Darth Vader,
and
the
yeah.
Death Star,
and the Death Star, yeah. That's the image we present. Even to the Turks now, where polling shows less than 15% of the Turks have a positive view of America. 10 years ago, it was 70% plus. This is insane, and it's going to be a huge challenge for the new president to mend our reputation, to put it on the mend, and to convince the world, including our friends and allies, that we haven't lost our head. that we're still a responsible global leader.
And have we militarized our foreign policy too much?
Extraordinarily so.
And how do we back away from that? I mean, is that going to be part of the problem here?
There are some radical solutions out there that I'm no longer calling radical. One I heard at the Naval War College would be something like this. You raise all the assistant secretaries who are regional at state, you raise them to undersecretary level, you then move them out into the regions for which they're responsible. Let's take the Pacific. You move them to Honolulu, and you put them in charge of the 4-star, who now is the senior diplomat for the region. You give them a staff that's on top of his staff. You make him the deputy. And so you have, instead of a unified military command, you have a unified diplomatic command with a military arm, and the civilian is the boss. Now that's a radical solution, but I, for one, having studied this for some 40 years, would be willing to be that radical in order to reverse this situation, where your diplomats suddenly become the arm of diplomacy and the people that are seen and listened to around the world, rather than your soldiers.
And so what this is going to take is a...
remember, I'm a soldier for 31 years.
Believe me, the things you're saying don't surprise people at Berkeley. they surprise people, coming from somebody like you with the experience you have. So this is going to take a Franklin Roosevelt type for national security, and somebody who has the vision, who can articulate that vision and have the support with the populace and in the Congress to do this.
Absolutely.
This is big time stuff.
It's going to require more than anything else leadership and good judgment.
Now let's put Colonel Wilkerson back in the classroom. How do you teach this to military officers and so on? Because obviously we have to have hope about a future where we move beyond this tragedy. But do you need to emphasize in your curriculum checks and balances, basically, and as you tell the story of the subversion of what was a national security process that worked?
I'll preface my remarks with this, which might surprise you, as you indicated you were surprised by my saying what I'm saying. More military officers than you might think feel the way I do. I've found more receptivity to what I'm talking about with regard to the imbalance between diplomacy and military power within the military than I have even within the foreign service, for example. Although they'll give you lip service to it, they'll then start talking about how they want to use force for this problem or that problem.
I see.
What I think is happening there is what was said to me by a 4-star general not too long ago. I am sick and tired of shouldering the burden of everything America does. Sick and tired of it. And I think it's dangerous. I think there's a realization of that in the military because we haven't pressed all the citizenry out of it yet. It's still got a lot of citizens who are citizens first and understand when they take that oath, they take it to the Constitution. That said, I think we're moving towards a time where if we don't do something along the lines of what you suggested, a good leader who takes this on and restores the balance, if you will, we're moving towards a time where we're going to regret the military we have. It's going to be more and more alienated from the body politic. It's going to be more and more from certain states. It's going to be more and more from certain socioeconomic conditions. For example, right now we have more aliens in the military than we've had ever on a percentage basis. They're there for good reason. They want their citizenship, but that just shows you how hard it is to recruit and shows you where we're getting our soldiers from. There's danger here in the future if we don't do something about this. If we don't restore the citizen soldier concept to our educational institutions and to the force in general, we're going to wind up with a Blackwater in, our uniforms.
Looking back now at all that you've just described and in the context of your career, what has surprised you the most as you've walked through this ongoing wreckage of a system that you worked for and believed for? I'm not talking about the American Republic, but rather the national security process.
That's pretty easy for me to say. I have been absolutely astounded at the lack of leadership, the lack of courage in the Congress of the United States, in the legislative branch. I go back there. I know, when Lincoln stood up on the floor of the House and gave his famous spot speech and lost his job because it was a very popular war with Mexico and got us a lot of new territory and fulfilled Manifest Destiny and all that. I know the Congress has been feckless before. Reading some of Lincoln's comments about the Congress will lead one to believe that it was, the House at least was a place where tobacco juice filled the floors. But I don't think we have had an occasion in my lifetime, which now spans over 6 decades, to see a Congress as incompetent, inept, weak, and without courage as the current one, and the one that was Republican in the first Bush administration. That astounded me. Now, people who will say, for example, to you, and this just happened last week, well, if they just weren't doing this money supplementally, we'd have some oversight. You don't have to approve the supplemental budget either. This is a cop-out. This is a cop-out. And I still don't see a real leadership aborting in that body, in either House, Senate, or House of Representatives. I think that's a real problem for the future. Couple that with the fact that most of the time precedents are set in the executive branch. They don't go away. And I think we've got a problem.
How do you explain the fact that there are such pockets of idealism, say among young people? You see that on the universities. You must see it in the...
Gives me the only hope I have.
Right, but when you started your career, say in the 60s, the government was able to marshal that ideal, as was Roosevelt in the time of the Depression.
Those were some pretty troubled times, too.
Right, but what's going to make that happen?
That's one reason I'm teaching. I'm excited every time I walk into a seminar of what I call 20-somethings. They want to do good. They want to be smart. They want to work for the federal bureaucracy. I try to encourage them to go out and interview with the CIA, go out and interview with the DIA. Don't go to the NGO. We need good people in the government, because that's the only way it's ever going to change. Sometimes I'll get a question, why would you recommend I go work for that agency that you told me overthrew Mossadegh in 1953 and built the relationship that we're now trying to deal with Iran that no American ever remembers, but every Iranian does? And I say, because how do you think it's going to change unless some talented, energetic, well-meaning, steeped in our history people go out there and work? So I'm optimistic when I'm in my seminars. I get really cynical when I get around people my age.
Colonel Wilkerson, on that note, I want to thank you for coming to our program. Thank you for coming to Berkeley. Thank you for the role that you played in Washington. But it was wonderful to hear you say these things in Berkeley on our program.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you very much for joining us for this conversation with history.